Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Management of Oak Wilt in Urban Areas. This webinar is being hosted today by Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements. My name is Shawn Bernick, and I'm the current Vice President of Research and Development here at Rainbow Tree Companies, and it's my pleasure to be discussing oak wilt with you today. Before we get into the presentation, I have a few housekeeping items that I would like to share. This webinar is worth one ISA CEU credit, and if you did not enter your ISA certification number during registration when you signed up for this webinar, you can enter it into the questions box now, which is located on your control panel as you're viewing this webinar. And the control panel should look like what I've taken here as a snippet of your screenshot. The question area, there should be a question tab that you can enter in your CEU number. Furthermore, if you have questions throughout the presentation, we do encourage your questions. Please enter them into the questions box and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards, so if you have coworkers within your company or organization that you think would have value from this, please invite them to go to our website and they can download the recording of this webinar, or if you have other people in the industry that you think would find value from this, please also invite them as well. Today's presentation will include a discussion on the biology and spread of the oak wilt pathogen, and really what you need to know as a consulting arborist or a practitioner that is important in how we manage and take care of trees to prevent them from being killed by oak wilt. We're also going to stress and emphasize management of oak wilt in urban sites. And we'll dig into some case studies that I've received from different arborist companies throughout the years that will provide good insights into some of their experiences and reinforce some of the management strategies for oak wilt management. Before we dig into the presentation, a little bit more on who I am. I actually graduated from the University of Wisconsin River Falls, which is a small education school in western Wisconsin. I double majored in horticulture and agricultural education, and then I went on to do my graduate work and receive my master's degree in plant pathology from the University of Minnesota. From there, my first position out of graduate school was working with the USDA Forest Service. And actually, this is how I got my start in working with trees and doing tree research. And it just so happens to be that that was focused on oak wilt management, working with Alamo fungicide to determine how it impacts and protects red oaks, both therapeutically and preventatively here in the Midwest, was what my research focused on and better understanding that. So I've got a lot of years of experience in treating oaks using the Alamo Macro-infusion method, and also a lot of experience in diagnosing and working with oak wilt out in the field, both in forested sites and urban sites. Currently at the company, I lead the R&D and technical support team, and our research team here collaborates with a lot of different industry and academia to create trials that ensure that our products, protocols, and our equipment provide predictable results for consulting arborists and practitioners. And then we also do a lot of training and education around that, much like what we're doing here today. So let's dig into oak wilt. Oak wilt was first described, actually the symptoms were described in the late 1800s. It wasn't officially documented until the early 1900s as an official disease. It was documented in Wisconsin. Oak wilt is a vascular wilt disease. It's caused by a fungus that inhabits the xylem tissues of trees, and it impacts oaks that are in the red oak family, oaks in the white oak family, and also impacts live oaks in Texas. Many of you have probably either seen or maybe even experienced large oak wilt stands in more forested areas, and certainly these can be very devastating and kill tens of thousands of trees very quickly, especially when you have contiguous stands of the same species. It happens to be most damaging with oaks in the red oak family as far as the rapid increase in mortalities, and also in live oaks down in Texas. And a lot of information has been established in how to manage oak wilt in these more forested areas, working with the USDA Forest Service and some of the larger DNR and other larger forested land management organizations. And I think there's good information out there. Certainly can be very challenging to manage in forested areas. But I also want to bring attention to some of the strategies around managing oak wilt in urban areas and some of the challenges that we are confronted with when managing oak wilt in urban areas. And I found it interesting. I actually took this from a website from a realtor here in Minnesota, right in the Twin Cities. And oak wilt is certainly a big issue in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, especially around the suburbs. And suburbs in the northern part of the metro area where we have very sandy soils. We've got a lot of contiguous stands of red oaks in those areas. And so oak wilt can be very damaging to these sites. And this was taken from a realtor, which I thought was quite impressive. The realtor knew about oak wilt and was providing information on education to interested home buyers. And if you read this, owning an acreage property with mature towering oaks and pines is the dream of many buyers. As a realtor in Anoka County, just north of Minneapolis-St. Paul area, I show my clients homes in the communities of Ham Lake, Lino Lakes, Linwood, and Forest Lake. How sad to see these trees dying a slow death caused by oak wilt. When we talk about oak wilt in urban areas, a lot of times it does follow in the footsteps of development. In many cases, as we'll talk later on in the presentation, you have trees that have been damaged and open up wounds for the insect vectors to come in and spread into new areas, and a lot of times that can happen throughout the building process, and you'll oftentimes find oak wilt moving around into these areas. And it can be quite devastating for a new homeowner that purchases a home that's got a lot of mature oaks on it, and to come to find out that they are dealing with a huge management problem on their hands, and all of the mature majestic oak trees that were part of the reason why they bought the house are now dying or have to be managed. So definitely a big issue in urban areas just as in forested areas. If you look at the host, we mentioned it earlier that oak wilt infects oaks within the white oak family, and this includes bur oak and white oak are most notable. There's other white oaks, oaks in the white oak family that are infected as well. And then we have oaks attacked in the red oak family, northern pin oak and northern red oak. We've got the Texas red oak or the Spanish oak, the Shumard oak, the southern red oak, and there's a number of other oak species, both in the white oak and the red oak family, that are not included on this list, but are susceptible to oak wilt. I've included most of the common ones here that we run into through our work with arborist companies. And then down in Texas, specifically, the oak wilt fungus attacks the Texas live oak as well. And it's important that we recognize how oak wilt attacks and infects these different species of oaks, because it's important from the management perspective, the diagnosis perspective, and our overall strategy and how we're going to combat and prevent oak wilt. Looking at symptoms on the different oaks, on red oaks, typically we're going to have necrosis from the tip of the leaves, dying back towards the base. Oftentimes, not always though, there will be a yellow line between dead and living tissue. In those cases with white oaks, you'll have similar symptoms, but in a lot of times with white oaks, the symptoms can be very easily confused or look like late fall coloring. However, you're still going to get the necrosis from the tip of the leaves dying back towards the base, and again, that yellow line may be present as well. It sometimes can have a drab olive color, almost a water-soaked color. It can be a little bit more challenging, in my opinion, to diagnose oak wilt based on leaf symptoms in the white oak family. On live oaks, you're going to have what's called venal banding and then venal necrosis or chlorosis. Typically, the leaves are going to die from the tip back, but they'll usually still have venal symptoms as well. So 3 different oak species and how the symptoms show up on the leaves. I think you need to combine the leaf symptoms of these trees with other diagnostic symptoms, and in some cases do a a lab analysis to confirm the presence of oak wilt. Other symptoms that you're going to see with all three of the species, in a lot of cases you're going to have premature leaf drop. So if you look at the base of oaks that are being attacked by oak wilt, you can see symptoms from oak wilt. And the leaves oftentimes will be in varying degrees of symptoms on the ground. Some may be totally brown, others may have that necrosis on the margins working their way in. But if you look on the ground near the base of the tree, you will see premature leaf drop. Something that's important to recognize, too, is that the fungus is invading and attacking the tree in advance of symptoms. And in some cases, the fungus can be introduced into the tree 2 to 3 weeks prior to symptoms developing. Now, with red oaks, trees are typically going to wilt very quickly, in a matter of weeks. And you can have mature oaks dying in 2 to 6 weeks. And it's very diagnostic. If you know you have something that's killing oaks very quickly, there's a possibility that it could be oak wilt. Another diagnostic feature of oak wilt in the red oak family is that you can have what's called the sapwood streaking, where you have the production of tyloses and gums in that active xylem tissue. That's a host response to the fungus, and it causes that blackish discoloration underneath the outer bark as you peel back that outer bark, and see that in the sapwood tissue. So if you take the leaf symptoms combined with the sapwood streaking, if you have a trained professional, there's a high probability that they can diagnose oak wilt based on field symptoms, and also knowing if the presence of oak wilt has been in the area or is in the area. On red oaks specifically, and only on red oak species, they will also produce spore mats. And these spore mats are going to be important in the insect vectoring. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. These spore mats attract the insect vectors, so you've got dead trees that will produce these typically the year after they die in early spring, and those will be attracted to some of the different beetles that spread oak wilt. They have a very aromatic, they give off an aromatic aroma, and that's attracted to the beetles, and then they will go and attack, find open wounds in healthy oak trees and spread the fungal spores that they have attached to their bodies that way. White oak symptoms, if you look at the tree itself, typically you're going to have wilting that will be a little bit more sporadic in white oaks. They have an ability to better ward off the oak wilt pathogen, and in some cases you'll see a branch or two dying per year. In a lot of cases, white oaks, bur oaks can withstand oak wilt infection and can live with the fungus and not even be killed by it. Symptoms are more scattered throughout the canopy, and that sapwood streaking that we see that's very prominent in the red oak family is not as consistent or prominent with white oaks. And typically, there's no spore mats produced with oaks in the white oak family. Live oaks, I know there's a couple of you located in and around Texas. Most on this webinar, most live oaks defoliate and die over a fairly rapid period of time, a matter of weeks to months, following the initial appearance of symptoms. However, some live oaks take longer to die, and there are cases where untreated trees where we've had a confirmed oak wilt may survive many years in various stages of decline. So they are not as susceptible and do not get killed as rapidly as oaks in the red oak family, but they probably will die more quickly and are more susceptible than oaks in the white oak family. Here is the biology and the life cycle of the oak wilt fungus. A couple key things that it's important as an arborist practitioner for you to know. It spreads in two different ways. First, or it can spread overland by insect vectors, and secondly through root grafts. And if you look at the oak wilt disease life cycle here, first of all, if you look at the dead tree here, the fungus is actually present as spores in the root system of dead trees, dead or dying trees, and if trees are close enough to be within root grafting distance of that dead or dying tree, those roots have grafts that can connect the roots from a healthy tree to a dead tree, and the fungus can move through those roots from one tree to the next. So that's one way that a healthy tree can become infected. The second way then, as I mentioned, oaks in the red oak family will produce these fungal spore mats. Those fungal spore mats then have the fungal propagules on them. Those actually will crack open. There will be bark splits that the insects will then be attracted to through the aroma. The nididulid beetles and other beetle vectors will then spread the pathogen from a dying tree to a healthy tree. And it's important to note that the oak wilt vectors require open wounds. And these oak wilt vectors will very quickly be attracted to these nididulid beetles, and so they will then transmit the spores into the healthy tree, and we start the cycle all over again. So it's important as a arborist that you know how it spreads and what the various stages are of this life cycle. Here's a close-up of those spore mats peeling back the bark on a dead red oak tree. It's also important to note that in April, May, and June, when these fungal mats are out, that is the highest risk period for these nididulid beetles, which are some of the more prominent beetle vectors that can be found quite often in the spring of the year. And fungal spore mats, one point to note too is that they can be produced in the same year. So if a red oak dies in early spring or the early summer, especially on smaller trees, they can produce spore mats later that season. But more often than not, those spore mats, as I mentioned before, are going to be produced the following year in early spring. So what about pruning? Does pruning an infected tree and then getting spores or propagules on your pruning tools cause the spread of oak wilt? Well, there's been some research looking at this, and for the most part, the research scientists believe that oak wilt is not spread on pruning tools. However, pruning can introduce open wounds onto our oak trees, and remember that those oak wilt vectors require an open wound to gain entrance into the tree. And so you'll see a lot of recommendations to not prune oaks in the Midwest April through July, when the peak beetle vectors are going to be flying around and when you have the spore mats present, and then also February through June in Texas and further south. As a practice, I think it's a good recommendation to train your customers to prune their oaks and other shade trees during dormancy. There's a lot of great benefits in doing this. From an arborist standpoint, you can see the structure much more easily and what branches require pruning. You're not dealing with all of the leaves. Furthermore, getting on sites with equipment can be a little easier, especially in the northern part of the country where we have frozen ground. And it can be a great revenue source during some of the slower parts of the winter months. Recognize, though, that if you do need to do pruning during these periods, April through July, February through June in Texas, that you should cover the wounds with a pruning paint. And these wounds, immediately as you make a pruning wound, it's that fresh tissue, that fresh cut that attracts these insect vectors. So within a matter of 24 hours, those vectors can be attracted. So as soon as you make that pruning wound, cover it with some type of a prune wound dressing. Even simple old latex paint can be sufficient. Another big thing to look out for, and this happened in the mid-2000s, late 1990s and into the early 2000s when we actually saw the oak wilt showing up. We had some major storms in the spring in one year in the late 90s here in the Twin Cities. And what we noted in the following 5 to 7 years after that is we had a lot of oak wilt showing up in these areas. And it's important to note that during a spring storm, you're going to get wounding and other damage to trees. Any open wound, again, can be susceptible to that insect vector coming in and spreading the oak wilt pathogen to those trees. Not much you can do about it, other than if you got to go in and do pruning again to clean up any storm damage, make sure that you're pruning those wounds. You can go in and prune, paint these storm wounds as well at that time of the year to minimize the spread of oak wilt. Let's look closer now at the spread of oak wilt through root grafts. As we mentioned before, the pathogen travels from infected trees to healthy trees via these underground root graft channels. This has been very well documented. Typically, oaks that are within the same species are going to root graft with one another. We do not typically see oaks in different families, in a lot of cases even in different species, grafting with one another. Most of the mortalities due to oak wilt are from trees that get oak wilt due to root graft. In a lot of cases, the vectors will bring oak wilt into a new area, and then from there, most of the oaks in an area will be killed due to root graft spread. It's important to recognize this because as we're managing oak wilt, we'll talk later on about disrupting root grafts to prevent the below-ground spread of the pathogen. And here is a really good example. This is on a golf course where you can see oak wilt came into this area at one point. It actually started back further in the background of this photo and actually off to the right. And the trees now that are dying here are dying due to the pathogen being contracted through root graft spread of the pathogen. Very quickly can kill oaks, especially in the red oak family or the live oak family. These root graft distances, especially in sandy soils, can travel up to a number of feet, as we'll talk about later in the presentation, to give you more guidance on how far what the distance is between two trees and the probability for root grafting. One thing that I'll mention really quickly is that there can be a number of different look-alike problems or causal agents that may mimic oak wilt symptoms, especially to the untrained eye. Some of those that you can confuse these with might be other diseases like oak anthracnose, could be abiotic problems, construction injury, root loss, drought, two-line chestnut borer, bacterial leaf scorch, and burrow blight. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this presentation today to go over these, but I did take a citation here from a great document that was created by the USDA Forest Service by Jill Picorni, Recognizing Common Diseases of Oaks in the Midwest, a quick guide. So this will help walk you through the different symptoms from different pathogens at least, and how to distinguish them from oak wilt. One thing that I'll mention too that's important is that especially when managing oaks in the white oak family, if there's other problems like two-line chestnut borer, construction injury, other stress events, you want to also take those into consideration when you're managing oak wilt, because we can treat and manage oaks in the white oak family therapeutically after they have symptoms. That oak wilt will cause stress on those trees. It can predispose them to other issues like two-line chestnut borer and other issues. So as you're managing oaks in that family, you want to make sure that you're managing the other problems as well. When you get into management of oaks in the red oak family, oak wilt is your primary concern that you need to stop and manage. And it'll kill a healthy or a declining or stressed tree just as easy as a healthy tree. Oak wilt management protocol. So there's 5 key aspects to managing oak wilt, and it's important that we do the management protocol in the order of the steps that we've outlined here. So assuming that we've diagnosed, we know oak wilt is in the area, the first thing is we're going to look at, are there any high-value trees that we need to prioritize that should be preserved and treated with macro-infusion of Alamo, which is a fungicide with the active ingredient propiconazole. After we do that, we're going to perform root graft disruption. We're going to remove the infected trees from the area. We're then going to retreat healthy oaks with Alamo fungicide in subsequent years and monitor for future oak wilt outbreaks in the area. We're going to go through each of these in greater detail now. So let's first talk about fungicide treatments with Alamo. There's 2 typical application techniques that have products that are labeled for managing oak wilt in the industry. The first one is the macro-infusion technique. And macro-infusion is where we take our fungicide and we dilute it in a very large volume of water. Typically, when we're managing oak wilt, we're recommending that arborists mix the Alamo fungicide in 1 liter of solution per inch of DBH. This is really the industry standard for managing oak wilt. There's a lot of great research that's been done by different universities as well as the USDA Forest Service and the Texas Forest Service that supports the use of Alamo Macro-infusion, and it's a very predictable treatment when the appropriate protocols are followed for managing oak wilt. Micro-injection is where the active ingredient is diluted in a small amount of water, or where you're directly injecting in the concentrated fungicide right into the tree. And there are a few different products that are registered and labeled for oak wilt. That doesn't necessarily mean that these products are effective. And really at this point there's very limited research demonstrating the efficacy on oak wilt. There has been a research project that's been done down in Texas that does show some promise for microinjection, but that's the only real research that suggests that the microinjection can be predictable. So at this point in time, Rainbow continues to recommend the macro-infusion method because of the success behind that. In a lot of cases, microinjection is much more effective when you're talking about insect management and the use of insecticides. Why is macro-infusion required and needed when applying the Alamo fungicide? Well, first of all, the higher water dilution rate is required so that you get even protection and distribution throughout the canopy and crown of the xylem tissue where this fungus is inhabiting. Furthermore, the Alamo fungicide needs to be diluted and applied at 1.5 to 2 injection sites per inch of diameter into the root flares to achieve that uniform distribution throughout the canopy. Here's some of the tools with macro-infusion. You can see that typically there is some type of a tank system for mixing up the water and the fungicide, and then you have a series of injection teas that you'll put in. 1.5 to 2 teas per inch of DBH is the common recommendation for the tea, number of teas, and you'll space those injection sites 4 to 6 inches around the base of the tree when doing macro-infusion. You'll also need a way to excavate the soil around the base of the tree, to excavate the root flares. Some people will use an air spade or an air tool to do that. You'll need a cordless drill, a soft malleted hammer, and then it's advisable to have a tank that has a pressure regulator and something that reads the pressure as well. You're delivering this fungicide typically into the tree at a PSI of about 15. In oak wilt macro-infusion treatments, depending on the size of the tree, soil moisture, and the uptake of the tree, the health of the tree, typically you can get product into a tree in a half hour to an hour or less. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer, especially if you have stress trees or very large trees. In some cases, the Alamo fungicide will go into the tree in a matter of minutes. It all depends on the health of the tree and the size and the soil moisture present. You're delivering this fungicide. It's important to realize into the active xylem and really using the transpiration stream in the tree to move it up into the crown. So which oak should be treated? This is an important distinction as it comes to managing oaks that are in the various red, white, and live oak families. First and foremost, probably the most important distinction here about red oaks is that preventative treatments are the only way in which you can treat oaks in the red oak family. So you're targeting healthy or asymptomatic trees that are not showing any above ground symptoms of oak wilt. Alamo does not work on symptomatic red oaks, and there isn't a fungicide on the market, unfortunately, that can reverse the symptoms of oak wilt on oaks in the red oak family that are showing symptoms. White oaks and live oaks, on the other hand, can be treated preventatively, and they can also be treated therapeutically. So white oaks and live oaks that have less than 30% canopy loss can be treated and can be very predictably saved if you catch them before they have less than 30% canopy loss. So that's a key distinction and something that you want to keep in mind when you're considering fungicide treatments. In a lot of cases, with white oaks and bur oaks, there's arborist practitioners, because of the high success rate, they will treat those trees therapeutically as a way to monitor. And so they'll monitor and keep a close eye on the white and bur oaks in areas, and if they show low-level symptoms, they'll treat them with a fungicide. So application timing. Macro-infusions with Alamo can be performed after full leaf expansion in the spring and can continue throughout the growing season until there is significant fall color. If you're talking about live oaks, really the only time that's, because live oaks are for the most part always in leaf out, the only time you have to avoid treating live oaks is during the leaf exchange period, which typically occurs in February or March each year. You want to make sure that the trees have their full complement of leaves, so that, again, you're tapping into the transpiration stream, so if you've got partial canopies or the trees aren't fully leafed out yet, you may compromise the uptake and distribution in the crowns of those trees. During times of extreme drought, a recommendation that we make is to advise the homeowner or the property owner to thoroughly water the tree prior to the application. That will help and aid in the uptake of the Alamo, and then after application as well. You can use a soaker hose. That's always a good recommendation to make for a homeowner, and some companies will actually sell those as a service, come out and set those up on properties to work with homeowners to do that for them. All macro-infusions should be performed prior to the removal of dead or dying trees. It's important you do that in that order. So dosage rates with Alamo for red oaks, again, preventative treatments only, and we recommend the highest dosage rate when treating red oaks, which is 20 milliliters of Alamo per inch of DBH. And then when treating oaks in the Midwest, we always recommend diluting that in 1 liter of water. One important aspect of Alamo fungicide treatments, if you can, in some cases in Texas this might be a little bit more challenging, but we always recommend to treat Alamo using that 1 liter of water per inch. Don't skimp on the water, because when you do that, you can compromise the distribution of the fungicide when you're making your applications. Dosage rate on the white oaks for preventative treatments, again, because they can much more withstand and tolerate oak wilt, we use the lower rate when doing preventative treatments on high-value oaks, which is the 10 mils of Alamo per inch of DBH. Again, the same water dilution. For therapeutic treatments, especially on trees larger than 25 inches, we recommend the 20 mils per inch of DBH, and then on trees less than 25 inches, 10 mils per inch of DBH. One thing that you want to take into consideration for white oaks and bur oaks, you can see phytotoxicity, leaf burning, especially during the dry, hot times of summer. And while it occurs only on the minority of trees treated, probably less than 5% of the trees that we treat, it does occur, and it's something as an expectation that you want to talk about with customers. To minimize this, again, you want to keep those trees well watered going into the application and after the application. Typically you can see brownish, blackish discoloration around the edges of the leaves, and the sucker sprouts in a lot of cases are where you'll see some of the phyto. In some cases you can get premature leaf drop, and we see it occasionally on live oaks down in Texas. It's important to note that the trees will leaf out if it's early enough in the season later that year, or leaf out the following spring. One thing on the white oaks that you can do too is reduce the dosage rate for any missing canopy that you have in the tree, so that you're putting in the appropriate dose. Dosage rate on live oaks, 20 mils of Alamo per inch, and then dilute that in up to 1 liter of water. In some cases, depending, because of the hot, dry conditions in Texas, it may be more challenging to get 1 liter of water into the tree, so I am aware of companies reducing that. But if you can, and certainly I would always recommend in the Midwest using 1 liter of water, especially in our larger red and white and bur oaks. Keys for tree injection success. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this today. We do have a webinar coming up on best management practices for tree injection. But here are some of the keys. You want to target those root flares. Don't make the applications of your injection sites up on the trunk of the tree. Use sharp drill bits. Can't stress that enough. Change those drill bits out every 5 to 10 trees. When you're drilling the hole into the root flares, don't unnecessarily spin the drill bit in and out of that hole. Make a nice, sharp, clean cut, a surgical-like cut. Space those injection sites evenly at the base of the tree. You're typically spacing them every 4 to 6 inches around the perimeter of the root flare, and again, that amounts to about 1.5 to 2 injection sites per inch of DBH. You want to drill to the appropriate depth, typically about 3/4 of an inch to an inch into the tree, and use the recommended amount of water as we talked about for complete distribution. So let's talk about root graft disruption now. Again, one of the 2 ways in which oak wilt spreads is via these underground root grafts, and so we need to recognize that when we're managing oak wilt. And there's a couple of different pieces of equipment that you can use to sever the root grafts between oak trees to minimize the risk of oak wilt spread. You can use a trencher like a ditch witch, which will typically get you down 2.5 to 3 feet into the soil. In Texas, they use these crazy big old rock saws that are good for cutting through some of their very rocky limestone soils down in Texas. And then you can also use what's called a vibratory plow to sever these root grafts. And this is one of the things, I think, a key distinction between managing oak wilt in urban areas versus in forested areas. While it's always part of the recommendation process for managing oak wilt in an urban area, there's a lot more challenges in performing root graft disruption in urban areas. You've got underground buried utilities, sprinklers, you have pools, you have retaining walls. You have a lot of challenges in doing root graft disruption in urban areas. And I know in talking with our service company, Rainbow Tree Care, which is a full-service tree care company here in the Twin Cities, while their consulting arborists recommend root graft disruption in oak wilt sites in urban areas on every single property, they probably on average get about 15 to 20% of those properties actually going through with the root graft disruption. So you have to do the best you can, and in some cases it's not always feasible or practical, or in some cases the homeowner doesn't have the budget. Recognize it should be always part of our recommendation. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can go about placing your barrier lines in the soil. This was a model developed by Dr. Dave French at the University of Minnesota. And there is an art to where you place these barriers. In French's model, he actually talked about placing a secondary barrier right next to your infected trees, in between your infected trees and your first tier of asymptomatic healthy trees. And then also a primary barrier further out, so you have 2 plow lines that he recommends putting in there. It's important to note that in a general rule of thumb, if you look at the root graft distance between an infected and a healthy tree, a lot of arborists will use a 50-foot line just as a general guideline. So trees that are within 50 feet of each other could potentially be root grafted, and they'll use that for their lines in some cases. There's more sophisticated models out there that take into consideration the soil type as well as the size of your infected tree and your healthy tree, and then based on your soil type and what the combined diameter is, you can go and use these different charts that will tell you, for example, a 20-inch tree on sandy soil, or combined DBH of 20 inches, say you've got 2 10-inch trees. In a sandy soil, those 2 10-inch trees, if they're within 39 feet approximately, there is a 95% confidence level that those 2 trees will be within root graft distance. And so you can use these models to place your root graft barriers in the soil as well. So here's the process. First of all, we need to find out where those underground utilities are buried and mark those and identify where those at. That typically will take a couple days or so. We're then going to go in and paint a line as to where we're going to put our trench line. And then for a trencher, for example, we're going to come in, we can get down 2.5 to 3 feet. Remember that while the majority of our roots are in that upper foot of soil, certainly we know that roots can go much deeper. They're going to seek out oxygen and pores. So they're going to be in the upper part of the soil, but you can get roots going down further. And I know the USDA Forest Service and Texas A&M recommends that if you can get down to depths greater than 3 feet up to 5 feet, you're going to increase the likelihood of you severing the majority of the roots, or more roots, the deeper you can go. 5-foot limitation is probably a good cutoff. Now with the trencher, you're not going to be able to always get that deep. You can see them severing the roots here and making that trench line. It can be fairly disruptive to the soil, but a lot of the consulting arborists actually like the trencher because it makes a pretty nice clean cut. In some cases, you got to work in and around sidewalks. So you do the best you can. Here's the final product where the soil is mounted up on top of the trench line. We allow some time for settling, and then you're going to have to come in and do some lawn restoration. And it's important with the expectations with trenching that homeowners know that their lawn will be disrupted. And more than anything, and in some cases more than what they perceive the value of their oak tree, they're concerned about their lawn and what it will look like afterwards. Not to mention their oak tree could potentially die if they don't manage it or sever the roots. So, but a lot of times the lawn is what they're most worked up about. Make sure those expectations are set. Vibratory plowing marked with paint again. The vibratory plow, while it gets to a greater depth of 5 feet, in talking with our maintenance folks here at Rainbow, these things are almost built and operate in spite of themselves. They are very, as they suggest, a vibratory plow has a lot of vibrations, a lot of moving parts. They require a lot of maintenance, a lot of breakdowns with these, and then they run on these tracks, and so you can get impressions and damage to the lawn. It typically will be harder on lawns than the trencher. You can see the vibratory plow blade inserted and how it works here. You get impressions on the lawn from the plow guides as well as the tracks from the tractor itself, which can heave the soil. And of course, you're going to need lawn restoration to be done here as well. It can be quite damaging depending on the soil conditions or the moisture of the soil. So you can see some of the damage that the vibratory plow creates here. So it can be tough in urban areas where you have high maintenance lawn, not to mention all of the other challenges with underground utilities and things that I mentioned earlier. So let's get into the third step in oak wilt management, which is removal of infected trees. And again, we're doing this in this order: Alamo fungicide treatments of your targeted trees, root graft disruption, and now we can go in and remove our infected trees. And it's important that we do this only after the fungicide treatment and after the plows have been performed, if you're able to do plows. Removing infected trees prior to treatments and plowing may speed up the rate of root graft spread to adjacent trees. And one important note about tree removal is that on red oaks that produce those spore mats, we want to remove those trees certainly before the following spring, before they can produce those spore mats, so we can reduce the spread of oak wilt in a given area by the oak wilt vectors. And why do we do it in this order, where we do the fungicide treatments, then the root graft disruption, and then remove the trees? Well, if we went in and removed our infected oak tree that is within root grafting distance of our healthy tree, you can actually get a draw of the fungus, of water and materials from the infected tree down into the healthy tree, much like you see in the illustration here of someone putting their finger over a straw. Kids do this all the time. You take a gulp through your straw, you suck some pop up through the straw, you put your finger on it. Well, your finger holds the soda in that straw. And if you remove your finger, then the straw, because of the capillary action of the soda in the straw, moves down back into your cup, or in the case with my kids, all over the table, and creates a big mess. Well, the same thing occurs with trees. If you remove that infected tree, that adjacent tree can draw in the oak wilt pathogen much more readily. Retreatment of healthy oaks with Alamo. So when should we retreat? What is our retreatment timing? A very common question that we get from people. With Alamo treatments, you're going to retreat the second full season after your first treatment. An oak should be treated at least 1 to 2 additional times after that initial application. So a tree treated originally in 2015 or this year should be retreated again in 2017 and 2019 as a minimum. So every other year. Why do we do this? Well, the fungicide does not eradicate oak wilt from the root system of the treated tree, and that's a very important distinction. Furthermore, the fungus can live up to 5 years in roots of dead trees, and very commonly 1 to 3 years. Even when you remove a tree, that fungus can remain viable in the root system of that dead tree for a period of time. And so that's why we have to retreat those trees for at least 1 to 2 additional times after that initial fungicide application. Treatment beyond that really depends on how much oak wilt is in the area and how good your monitoring is. If it's a high-value oak tree, I know some practitioners will just continue to treat those oaks if they know they have oak wilt in the area, and that's especially important for trees in the red oak family, again, that we can't treat therapeutically. And again, as you'll see in some of the case studies, if you fail to retreat those trees for that second and third time, there is a higher risk of losing those trees. And that's an important expectation that you need to set with the customer so they know they're going to need to commit to follow-up treatments to prevent oak wilt from further attacking and killing their protected trees. Can't stress it enough, also in urban areas, you need to continue to monitor for oak wilt. Once you think you got a good handle on oak wilt and you have all the trees protected and the dead or infected trees removed, you have to continue to monitor the neighboring sites, the adjacent properties. In a lot of cases, a challenge in urban areas is getting neighbors to band together to work to manage oak wilt. You may have some neighbors that don't place as much value on their oak trees, or they can be challenged. They can challenge their other neighbors who do want to protect their trees, in that oak wilt really doesn't pay much attention to borderlines of properties. So it's important to try to get neighbors to educate them and understand that working together can be a good way to manage oak wilt and protect trees as a community. So let's dig into some case studies here in the last few minutes of the presentation. The first case study, we had a consulting arborist visit a site here in the Twin Cities in July of 2014. 5 days later then they made the recommendation. They noted that there was a dead or dying red oak on the property, and 5 days later they came in and treated 6 healthy red oaks. They also performed 645 feet of trenching on the property, which was done later in August. And in this case, as you can see on the map here, you had a pocket of 6 dead red oaks that were identified by the consulting arborist. They then had the closest healthy tree was treated with the Alamo fungicide. That tree, in between that tree and some additional trees were additional high-value oaks that were treated with Alamo as well in the blue circles. So you can see that on this case the secondary plow line was placed in between this first healthy tree and these other 5 trees that were treated. And then we placed in primary lines a little further out to protect all of the red oaks that were on other areas of the property, both on the left and the right here of this diagram. Now, one unique aspect of the secondary or the primary plow lines here, excuse me, is that the arborist recommended 2 parallel primary plow lines in this case. And these root grafts will graft back into each other within a period of a few years. And so in doing so, they spaced these primary plow lines about 5 feet apart, increasing that span and increasing the time in which the customer would have to come in and redo these plow lines. So you do have to redo these plow lines over time if oak wilt remains in the area. That's important to know. Now, if you're able to eradicate all of the dead and dying trees from the area, that may not be needed unless oak wilt returns back into the property. So the second case study is on bur oaks, 2 bur oaks that were treated therapeutically at the 10 mil rate of Alamo. One of those trees was displaying 20% symptoms, the other was displaying 15% symptoms. So the key here, again, we're able to treat oaks in the white oak family therapeutically. And then we also had 9 high-value bur oaks that were within root grafting distance of these infected trees. So the consulting arborist recommended treating these at the lower rate, and these trees range from 15 to 26 inches in diameter. And at this site, plow lines were not feasible due to buried utilities and irrigation lines. And so you can see here, first of all, there was an infected tree that was removed. And then we had the 2 bur oaks that were treated therapeutically, trees 14 and 15. And then the homeowner and the consulting arborist worked together to develop a plan that fit their budget then to treat some of the surrounding bur oaks that were within root grafting distance of those infected trees. The third case study, and this is an interesting one because it really tells the story of the requirement for homeowners and customers and expectations from arborists that they've got to stay the course when managing oak wilt on a particular property. So in 2008, there was one wilting northern red oak that the consulting arborist had identified here when the homeowner called. Alamo treatments were performed on 7 additional red oaks on this property, and there was 275 feet of vibratory plow lines that were created. And it was stated, and I would recommend that you state in the written proposal the requirement to do those additional 1 to 2 treatments of Alamo. So the homeowner knows that right up front, that they're going to need to commit to that to ensure a higher level of success. So it was stated in the written proposal back in 2008 that all 7 of those trees that were treated with Alamo would need to be retreated in 2010. Well, written proposal was sent out to the customer to retreat those 7 red oak trees in 2010. However, the homeowner did not execute on the retreatments. Wouldn't you know it, the homeowner then called up in 2012, and they had one of the original treated red oaks that was now showing symptoms of oak wilt. So then the homeowner decided to retreat the remaining 6 trees. And at this point in time, because 4 years have elapsed, they also made the decision to replow all of the plow lines. And again, it was stated in the written proposal that the homeowner would need to retreat the 6 remaining trees again in 2014. Homeowner was sent a proposal to retreat the oaks, and no action was taken again until the homeowner called because one of the trees was now wilting. And this was back in 2014. And we're hoping that we can treat at least the remaining 5 trees that are on the property. So it speaks to staying the course and making sure that they do those retreatments, and certainly you're going to have budget constraints and other things like that. But if they're high-value trees that you want to protect over time, make sure you follow through with all the steps that we're recommending here for the highest degree of success. You'd hate to have a homeowner invest thousands of dollars in plow lines and treatments only to have a dead tree at the end of it, or dead trees at the end of it. Here's that property showing the primary, the secondary lines, and the layout of the infected and the healthy trees. These are maps actually. It's important that you map out the area and you have some type of a mapping system that you utilize. You measure the diameters of those trees. It's a good business reason to do this. You know what types of trees your customer has on your property, but you can also take this back to your office and work up the proposal as to where the plow line should be and what trees you should recommend for treatment. So always try to have some type of a mapping system where you can map out the specific location. Take out a measurement wheel and measure out the distances as well when you're out on the property. Here's a much larger property, and in this case we were only able to do plow lines. They had too many oak trees. I take that back. They did do some fungicide treatments to the trees in green that were up closer to the house that were higher priority, but the majority of what the homeowner here was mainly focused on was trying to use plow lines on this very large property. This was a multi-acre property in a wooded area, and so we tried to create secondary and primary plow lines to ensure that this oak wilt area was retained and didn't spread into larger areas within the property. And so this is just a map of the actual buildings. Here you can see over the airplane view of the map. So there's a lot of oak trees in more of a forested area that the homeowner was really concerned about on this property that we wanted to try to protect and preserve over time. So a few case studies for you to think about. Really the key take-home pieces for managing oak wilt. Number one is important to diagnose correctly the problem. Do your Alamo fungicide treatments for high-value trees. Then go in and make your plow lines. Remove any infected trees. Use proper sanitation. Don't prune oak trees during the peak beetle spread. Try to prune your trees during the winter months. Retreatment of Alamo at the specific recommended retreatment dates, and then continue to monitor for oak wilt in the area, keeping a close eye on your customers' trees. So that concludes the oak wilt presentation. I do want to bring your attention to a civic project that Rainbow is partnering with a number of organizations throughout the country on. And this is aimed at beautifying some of our veteran cemeteries to keep them beautiful and safe for all who visit and want to appreciate our veterans. So we're working on a project that will take place on September 23rd of this year, and we're rallying to get volunteers, and our goal is to have 1,000 volunteers signed up to help us manage the trees on 22 different veteran cemeteries on federal lands across the country. And if you're interested in this, you can go to salutingbranches.org to learn more about this. We're looking for site leaders and sponsors in addition to volunteers, and we would love to have as many of you on this webinar to participate in this as possible. If you have questions, you can go to the website or contact me directly. Also bring your attention to the upcoming webinars that we have here. There's some good ones coming up throughout the rest of March and April here. Please go to our website to sign up for those. And with that, we've got a few minutes to entertain questions. And I'll just go ahead and entertain questions here. If we have more of them that take us past 12 o'clock Central Time, you're more than welcome to stay on today as I address those questions that you put into the chat box. If you got to drop off, thank you for your participation. And have a great year. Good luck with business. Thank you. Okay, so a few questions here. First question, are there any long-term environmental effects of Alamo? Alamo is directly injected as a fungicide into the tree and the root flares, and so it's very benign and inert as it relates to any impacts on humans or the environment. And furthermore, it has a very specific mode of action that is effective against fungal pathogens, but it has minimal to no impact on humans or any secondary benefits, any beneficial organisms. So that's very minimal, and because we're applying it directly into the tree, as I mentioned, it's very targeted. You do want to take precautions as an applicator, making sure you're wearing the appropriate PPE and mixing and applying the correct dosage rate. It's always important when you're applying any pesticides, of course. Should an infected white oak be pruned first before treatment? One of the things that I would recommend for when you're treating white oaks, as far as pruning the tree, I would actually go in and make the fungicide application as soon as possible. If you're trying to prune oak wilts out, say it's in a lead of a tree, you can go in and make the pruning cut. I've always been a proponent of trying to get the fungicide in the tree as quickly as possible in a therapeutic treatment, but perhaps your operations don't allow for that. Certainly, because white oaks have the ability to wall off the pathogen and tolerate the oak root fungus more, you don't have as much risk for that spreading quickly in the tree like you would in a red oak So trying to therapeutically prune out the oak wilt pathogen isn't as big of a concern. So I would base it off of your operational schedule. I would try to prune out any dead or dying areas at some point as quickly as you can, but I would get the fungicide in the tree first. Okay. A few more questions here. How often will you need to redo the plow lines? Typically those roots are going to be regrafted with one another in 3 to 5 years or so. In all recent literature, painting wounds was not advised. Is this case you mentioned an exception? Great question. This is an exception to that, and I do concur with all the recommendations to not place pruning wound dressings when you're doing your pruning. However, if you are pruning oak trees, especially during the peak beetle spread in the spring of the year, this is one time when you absolutely want to put a pruning wound dressing on. Advice on even distribution of chemical on multi-stem trees, injecting high-value trees with no wilt nearby, and pricing. This is one, I won't address the pricing question here today, but certainly when you're doing multi-stem trees, you want to measure the diameter of the tree at the widest space below where the multi-stems split. So typically this is below diameter at breast height. And then you want to also look at, once you've got your measurement, your DBH measurement, does it adequately reflect the crown for the size of tree that you are injecting? In some cases, you may have to put your injection sites up on the trunk of the tree because in multi-stem trees, if they're too close, it may be more challenging. If the trunks are too close, it may be more challenging to get the fungicide to go up into those more interior areas on those multi-stem trees by only injecting on the root flare. So this might be an instance where you would want to make your injections on the trunk of the tree, but you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. This webinar will be posted as a recording as well, and you can get that off of our website. It should be up there in the next 1 to 2 weeks. Does micro-injection work for a treatment on oak wilt? As I mentioned before, the industry standard is macro-infusion. We currently don't recommend micro-injection, and I would not recommend it as something that would be predictable. There is some research data in Texas. However, that's been only in one trial, and furthermore, I think there needs to be a lot more research on trees in the Midwest and other parts of the country to really state that micro-injection is going to be effective. Some of the micro-injection devices I know are definitely not effective because they apply too low of a dosage rate and they don't have that complete even distribution around the tree. So, knowing that bur oaks have the capability to compartmentalize oak wilt, should treatment be administered every other year or just allow the tree to naturally respond to the invading pathogen? That's a great question, and on oaks in the white oak family, you don't necessarily have to retreat every other year. I would treat, a lot of companies, as I mentioned, are targeting trees in the white oak family as therapeutic treatments. Once you've treated the tree, the oak wilt symptoms have subsided, you may not need to do a retreatment. One question, though, that I would ask the homeowner, the property owner, is, what's the relative value of that tree, and how much oak wilt is in the area? How much risk is there? Those would be the questions that I would ask. But you can very predictably treat trees after they have shown symptoms if they're in that white oak family. So bur oaks, white oaks. It's just a matter of how close of an eye can you keep on it, the property owner themselves keep on it, so that you can catch it before less than 30%. Okay, thanks for all your questions, and with that, I will conclude the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, again, my contact information is available here. You can contact our Solutions Center at our toll-free 1-800 number. And thank you for your time today.